The sky took them while I stood on the porch and thought it was a trick of the light. I still remember the hush before the ascent, the kind of quiet that presses against your chest and makes your own breathing sound obscene. It was late, the street lamps had a halo of frost, and the old sycamore by the house cut a black serrated silhouette against a grainy, indifferent twilight. One by one, like church lanterns dimming, my sister, my mother, the neighbor who used to bring me cookies, they rose. Not with wings or fanfare, just upward, slow and inevitable, carried by a cold, thin luminescence that smelled faintly of metal and rain. I called their names until my voice went raw. They answered once each, with the same soft surprise, then were gone through a seam in the sky that I couldn't make sense of. I didn't reach for them. The truth is worse and smaller than cowardice. I felt rooted, not by knees or earth, but by something coiled in my chest, a ledger of wrongs, a patient gravity that kept me here. Later, the town would call it a miracle. Some would say a cleansing, strangers in bright coats knocking on doors asking what it felt like to be spared. I told them I was lucky. Lucky felt obscene, like a joke whispered wrong. The first night after, the world turned its face away. Houses stood like closed mouths. My phone found no signal, as if the towers had also risen and left a hollow where connection used to be. Sound became a thin, brittle thing. At 2 a.m, I heard a child laughing down the lane, my neighbor's boy. But when I opened the door, there was no one, only an outline on the fog where the streetlight failed. The laugh bent, stretched, and broke into something that could not be a human throat. Small things began to betray me. The cat that used to sleep on the mat didn't return. Photographs in frames blurred at the edges, as if someone had slowly painted over the smiles. There were footprints in the wet dirt outside my back door, too long and narrow to be mine, but they stopped at the threshold like someone reconsidering entrance. Most terrifying was the feeling of being watched from the spaces between objects, from the place where shadow meets shadow, not a staring of eyes, but of intention, patient and clinical, cataloging. I learned to listen in that silence. There were other noises, the soft patter of something moving across the roof, a scrape near the chimney, a distant, delicate tapping that sounded like fingernails on glass. When I pressed my ear to the wall, the house gave up a breath that was not its own. I was alone in a town that had thinned to echoes, and every echo seemed to be waiting for me to name my sins. They learned my name the way rain learns the ground, by repetition, until there was nowhere left to hide. Sounds stitched themselves into patterns I could not ignore. A thud that matched my heartbeat, a whisper under the sink that sounded like my mother, a voice on the line that was my sister's until the vowels curdled. They used that familiarity like a hinge. The first clear voice belonged to the neighbor who took my newspaper. I woke to porch light bleeding through the blinds and a coat-shaped shadow by the door. When I opened it, he spoke in the exact cadence he used to complain about the weather. "You left your door open," he said. It was his voice, hollow as a drum. I slammed the door. The darkness seemed to smile. They imitated absence, laughter, a baker's whistling, the creak of my father's steps. Sometimes they left props, an old mug, a folded paper, things meant to fool sight while scent betrayed them. Ozone, pennies, and an underlying sweetness like rotting fruit. My hand would pass through a mug and touch fur or fabric that did not belong to me. Worse were the offers. They spoke of bargains in the mirror. "We can bring them back," one murmured. "You only need to tell us who you are." It was never a name they wanted, but a moment. The time I skipped my grandmother's bedside, the afternoon I lied for safety, the night I ignored a knock. They wanted these omissions, proof of my small cruelties. When I refused, the house cataloged them. Sometimes they wore my face. In fogged glass, my reflection was me, but the smile was too wide, the eyes too patient. I would reach as if touching that face would mend the world. My fingers met cold air. It felt like the house had taken a claim. I stopped sleeping in my bed. I found myself at dawn on the floor, knees knotted as if arranged for inspection. There were marks on my arms, tiny incisions, tally-like, and the smell of a finished meal lingering as if something had feasted and left. Voices recited names in a chorus, strangers, people I knew, and then mine. After each name, a terse note, omitted, delayed, unclaimed. The knocks began slow, one per sin I could not forgive. They moved through the rooms, kitchen, hallway, the places where photographs had blurred into light. Each knock counted me down. When they reached the attic, my chest tightened with a verdict. Silence felt worse than answering, so I opened the trapdoor. Up there, the air smelled of rain on metal and old paper. Shapes hunched in the rafters like birds that had forgotten to be birds. Figures with limbs too long, faces folded in on themselves, mouths that remembered laughter and could not shape it right. They tilted their heads, listening. I realized the truth I'd been circling. They were not hunting the living. They hunted the ones left with guilt to feed them. The attic light blinked like a tired eye. For a long time, I only watched them, these hunched things in the rafters that had learned to fold themselves into corners where grief collects. The air up there tasted of iron and ash. Dust rose like breath when I stepped, and the beam from my phone made their faces a constellation of wrongness. Some faces were too flat, as if pasted on. Others had teeth in places teeth should never be. When they moved, it was like watching a clock rust, soft, inevitable, each limb arriving a fraction too late to be human. One of them slid down to the beams with the grace a moth fumbles with light. It spoke in my father's cadence at first, slow, careful, but the words were not his. "You kept them," it said, as if listing an account. "You kept them from leaving clean." The attic shrank. I felt the house inhale, and in that breath I heard the town, the hollow chirp of an empty swing, the far-off damp thunk of shutters. Behind the mimicry there was a calculus. They did not want my body, they wanted my ledger. I tried to bargain. I offered small things first, the names of the faults I could remember, the petty cruelties that seemed to hurt less when told aloud. I lied to get out of work, I said. I let him wait in the rain. Each confession was a flint strike, and for a moment the room warmed as if some small light had been struck. The figures leaned closer, rapt. They repeated the words back to me, and where I hesitated, they supplied the missing angles until the memory was whole and raw. Admitting the truth did not absolve. It polished the sin into a shape they could feed on. Their methods were intimate. One brushed my hair with hands that smelled of lemon and mildew, and in the scent carried the ghost of my daughter's shampoo. A chorus hummed the lullaby my mother used to hum, each note a scalpel, each repetition opening some soft place inside me. I thought, briefly and foolishly, that perhaps naming my sins would win them mercy. Mercy did not arrive. Instead, my recollections became a banquet. I saw what they did to those they consumed. In the gaps where faces had been, emaciated like moth-eaten portraits, there opened small, pale windows, places where laughter used to be, through which a cold light pulsed. They were not simply eating flesh or stealing life. They were excising memory and knotting the residue into their bodies. The more I watched, the more I understood. To be taken to the sky had been a removal, a surgical erasure. Those who left were relieved of the weight that made the monsters hungry. I could see the relief like steam around their shoulders in each faint silhouette that rose, an easing that had nothing to do with wings. Panic is a kind of clarity. When I tried to run, the house remembered every step I had ever taken inside it and redirected me. Doors that should have opened remained sealed. Rugs that had always been soft now scratched at my heels. I stumbled into the living room and found the photographs waiting, faces blurred into paper frost, smiles cut out like missing teeth. Their edges whispered as if turning pages, and from each void a voice came, not to call me by name, but to recite the moments I had chosen to ignore. "I could have come back," my sister's voice said from a frame. "You could have been with us." It was not reproach so much as observation. The monsters did not need to hurt me to win. They needed me to see clearly how small my defenses had been. The house wanted my acceptance. The house wanted the ledger open. In the end, there is always a point where choices narrow to a single seam. I had one last thought of climbing the sky myself, leaping, begging, offering any currency for ascent, but I had no wings and no light took me. Instead, I felt a pressure at the base of my skull, like a thumb tracing a line through the varnish of my life. The figures folded around me with a tenderness that was not kindness. As they touched, memories unstitched, the warmth of a hand in mine, the smell of coffee on a Sunday morning, the exact tilt of a laugh. They tasted of omission, and as each memory slipped free, it passed through them and out into the dark, a filament of light that they swallowed like a candle. They did not devour me in one night. It was slow, surgical, as if they were teaching me how to be unmade. I kept my eyes open because some part of me wanted a record. I wanted to know what remained of the man who had stood on the porch while the sky took the rest. My hands grew absent to themselves. I watched them as if from across a room. When at last I could no longer hold the shape of my daughter's laugh in my mouth, when the syllables collapsed and fell like dead leaves, something in me understood the finality. Survival here was a sentence, not a mercy. They raised me from the floor and arranged me in a corner where other survivors leaned like old coats. We were witnesses and evidence, our soft parts removed and displayed as lessons. One of the figures, my neighbor's voice now, but with a spline of something older, leaned close and shaped its mouth into my mother's words, perfectly, finally. I thought I could still protest. I could not. There is a difference between death and being left. I learned that the last thing you lose is the demand to be forgiven. They left me with the monsters.
Subscribe to Horror Story Bar.